In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about equipment and IPF approval. And I think I'm a pretty good person to speak on this subject because who else do you know that has 10 pairs of squat shoes, 5 weightlifting belts, a dozen knee sleeves, and the creme de la creme, 6 or 7 singlets. And I keep buying more of those. I have a problem. Self-admitted. It's weird. But anyways, I have a lot of stuff, so I get a lot of questions from people in regards to what equipment should they buy, how does A compare to B, and of course, the 2 magic words that everyone wants to know, IPF approval. So anytime I do a video on a piece of equipment, that's one of the comments that I get in the comment section if I don't address it in the video. Yes, but is it IPF approved? Because this is a big deal to a lot of people, but should it be? So the reason I want to do this video is because anytime I do a competition or I show some of my lifts, in these meets like the USAPL, which feeds into the IPF, a lot of people will notice I wear things like Mark Bell's strong sleeves, my Pioneer customized weightlifting belt, maybe a singlet with a logo on it. And a lot of people are wondering if the IPF changed their rules. So I figured I'd just go ahead and make a video and talk about exactly why I can wear some of these things in competition and why more than likely you can too. Now, in order to do that, instead of me sitting up here and yammering on and making some bad sexual innuendos even further, let's first take a look at a very thorough spreadsheet put together by Joe Marksteiner, who's the founder and chairman of the USAPL Technical Committee. All right, so this list is pretty easy to break down. On the left-hand side, you have all the pieces of equipment that you could potentially use in a powerlifting meet. Some are mandatory, some are not. So for example, you have to have a t-shirt, shoes, socks, and a singlet. Sorry, fellas. Whereas the other things on this list aren't necessary depending on how you lift or what type of competition you're doing. So belt, knee sleeve, wrist wraps, etc. If you choose not to use these when you lift, then you don't really need to pay attention too much to this video. Then along the top, you have different levels of competition from local to state to regional to national to international. And beneath that, you have the designation at which that equipment needs to meet. So for example, if we're taking a look at belts here, if you're doing a local or state level meet, which in the most part for you watching this video is probably the type of meets you'll be doing, and I'll explain why in just a second, you just need to meet IPF specs, as opposed to things like regional, national, or an international level. They need to be on the IPF approved list. Now you also see things like the USAPL Rulebook versus the IPF Rulebook. No matter what you see on this particular spreadsheet, if you want more information, you can find them by using the links below. But you've probably figured out by now that this is just a screen capture and you can't actually click on the screen to access those links, although you might accidentally click on an ad and make me some money, which would not necessarily be a bad thing. But I'll throw all of these links in the description box below in case you want to go check them out, which you should do even if you're not planning on using any specific equipment. It's always good to know the different rules for the federations that you're going to compete in. But again, let's go back to our example here of a belt. Let's say we're going to compete at a regional, national, or international level, and we want to make sure either the belt that we currently have or the belt that we're looking at meets the IPF approved list. Well, when I pull that up, what you'll see here is a short list of vendors highlighted here in red and all the equipment that they produce that is considered IPF approved. Now, I will note not all pieces of equipment from all these manufacturers are necessarily approved. For example, if I go down here until we finally get to the super training product Slingshot, you'll notice that the Slingshot knee sleeves are on here, but the Slingshot strong sleeves, which I wore in my last competition, are not. So just because a vendor is on here does not mean all pieces of their equipment are necessarily approved. So how do I get away with using those in competition? Well, if you look back here, you can see from the local and state level, things like knee sleeves, belts, singlets, and wrist wraps all just need to be IPF spec'd, which you can find from either the USAPL or IPF Rulebook. So again, if we go back here and take a look, for example, the USAPL Rulebook, here we have the designation for belts. It gives you an overview of what your belt needs to meet in order to be gained admittance into that specific competition. It really breaks down to the materials, the construction, the length, the width, all sorts of different things. Again, all defined in this rulebook. And again, because most of us will be competing at a local or state level, this is what we have to really focus on. So let's talk more about IPF approval. So that being said, does IPF approval really matter? I'm of the opinion for the majority of people it doesn't still. And that's because I find that most people are going to compete at the local or state level for the majority of competitions they do. Namely, number one, because if this is your first USAPL meet, it has to be a local or state level meet because those are the only ones that don't require some type of experience going into it, as opposed to things like regional, national, or international meets where you need not only previous experience, you also need a qualifying total, and in some cases, you also need an invitation specifically to attend. And subsequent meets for most people, local and state level seem to be where you'll spend the majority of your time because not only are the frequency of them much more often than, let's say, a regional or national level meet, which only happens once per year, but also the ease of getting to that competition. They're called local for a reason. They're typically right down the street, or in some cases, maybe an hour or two away. It gets to be more difficult when you start talking about things like regional, which require maybe several states worth of travel, nationals, which might require a plane flight, or international, which might require several plane flights. So again, they don't happen that often, and they're harder to get to, and they're also much more expensive to travel to, and a lot of people just don't want to do that. So since you'll be spending most of your time at the local or state level, it makes the most sense to me just to worry about being IPF Specced, in which case if you already own equipment, it probably is, or if you're buying equipment for the first time, you have a lot more choices in what you get in terms of is it budget friendly, and most importantly, does it match the rest of your outfit? Because we all know that's most important. Now, if you're eventually planning on competing at a level that needs IPF approval, then yes, if you're buying for the first time, it might make sense to at least consider getting that done out of the way so that way you don't have to reinvest. But for those of you that need to reinvest, I kind of put it this way. If you're already investing that kind of time and effort into your training, and not to mention you're willing to spend the money to travel to some of these meets, spending a couple extra bucks on the equipment probably isn't that big of a deal to you. So hopefully that answered some of your questions. If you have equipment or are looking to buy something and you're worrying about IPF approval, again, I wouldn't really worry about it for the most part. And if you have other questions regarding that, make sure you leave them in the comment section below. So again, a big thanks to Joe Marksteiner for the spreadsheet, but I also have to thank Chris Aydin from TSA as he was the one that sent it to me and allowed me to use it. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you next video.